Hello and welcome back to my channel. My name is Jackie and I'm an aspiring fiction author who's currently preparing for NaNoWriMo. And if you've seen the last couple of videos, you'll know that this is a different setup. I'm actually filming from an Airbnb in Istanbul at the moment. Now, in today's video, I'm going to be attempting to plan my ideas for NaNoWriMo using Save the Cat. Unlike the other two books that I'm using for this challenge, which are Take Your Pants Off by Libby Hawker and Story Engineering by Larry Brooks, I hadn't actually read this one before I started getting into the challenge. So I've just finished this and I loved it. You can probably tell from the number of post-it notes I've got in here. As a former non-fiction editor, one of the things I often struggle with books that are supposed to be really practical, so how-to non-fiction books, is that there's so much waffle around the main process, and I just want to get immediately into what should I do to make this work. And what I loved about Save the Cat is that even though there are some anecdotes and the author, Blake Snyder, does put his personality onto the page, most of it is really practical, really granular. So I read this over a couple of days, but if you had a day on the weekend or you're not working, you could easily finish this in a day. So it's a really quick read and there's a lot of gold in here. So what does Save the Cat teach? It is actually a book on screenwriting. However, a lot of authors use it because the principles that go into a good screenplay are the same principles that would go into writing a good novel. And the reason is that these principles are about storytelling. And a good story is a good story regardless of whether the final product is a book or a film. So even though it's designed for screenwriting, and that means when it gets into the plotting section or the different beats you need to cover in your book, the page counts are a lot smaller than they would be in a novel. I think there's still value in using this for a novel and just throwing the page counts out of the window for the time being, but ensuring you hit those beats. Now, when it comes to the process, this book actually covered so much more than I was expecting, because if you've done any research on plotting and pantsing and so on, you'll probably come across Blake Snyder's story beats on the internet. So I knew there was going to be these set beats that I needed to hit when mapping out my story. What I wasn't expecting was how much other stuff there'd be. So when it comes to the process in the book, step one is figuring out your logline. This is the one-line description of what your book or your screenplay is about. Step two is figuring out which genre that fits in. One of the things I really appreciated about this book was that Blake has listed something like 8 or 12 genres that every story falls into. So figuring out how to categorize your story is really helpful and one of the, I think, early warning signs of whether the story is going to work or not. Because if it doesn't fit in any of those one genres, then there's a good chance it's going to start falling apart when you start writing it. Step three is figuring out your character. So who is the main person? What do they want? What's getting in their way? What development do they need to go through in order to reach their goal and the end of the film or book? Then the next step is beating it out. So there are 15 different beats that your story should hit. After that, he has a storyboarding technique. So you create a board and then once you have your beats and your scenes, you map them out as you would once you start writing. And this is, for some people, this might be an optional extra step after they've mapped out the 15 beats. However, I think it's really helpful to do as much of this work before you start writing, because then hopefully you can see any big issues before you start writing. And one of the things I'm realizing as I do this work is that there are probably fundamental flaws in the last draft that I printed and put away a couple of weeks ago that mean that it could potentially need a full rewrite. So hopefully using methods like this, the next book I attempt to write won't. Once you've done those steps, so your logline, your genre, your character, your story beats, and your storyboard, the next chapters in the book are more troubleshooting or diagnosis. So I feel like the first, I think that was 5 steps. The first 5 steps are what you do before you start writing to make sure the idea is solid and everything is mapped out and hopefully you have an easier writing process. Whereas the next couple after that are really to diagnose problems once you have a draft. So the next chapter is on the immutable laws of story physics. So these are basically rules for getting stuff done without messing it up. So Things like Save the Cat, which the book is named after, is giving your character some way for us to like them as soon as we meet them. So some quirk, some moment of empathy that means that even if they might not seem like a nice guy to the outside world, we can still root for them. So one of the examples he gives is in Disney's Aladdin. Now, Aladdin is a homeless thief, maybe not the most sympathetic character for some people, but in Disney's version, he goes and steals his bread, and then he sees a couple of small children who look really hungry and gives the bread to them. So we can see that this is a nice guy. We're on his side. We want him to win. So this chapter actually has a number of rules like that, which I think would be helpful once you're going through your screenplay or your novel and you're seeing what does and doesn't work. And the next chapter, chapter 7, has a similar approach. It's just even more granular. So it's what's wrong with this picture, and he's listed a number of different symptoms that come up in stories that don't work. So one of them that really resonated with me is the idea that the hero is supposed to drive the story, whereas a lot of stories you have authors who are just throwing problems at their hero and the hero sort of needs to react. And I know I've been guilty of this in my past book. So figuring out how the hero can drive the story, how they make the decision to answer the call to adventure and so on, makes for a much more compelling journey for your audience. And after that, he has a chapter which is on basically making it as a screenwriter, which was interesting but not so relevant if you're an author, and also not so relevant if you actually haven't written the book yet. So all in all, I thought this book was fantastic, and there is so much to cover here that I think there'd actually be value in doing multiple videos on this. So for this video, I'm purely focusing on the couple of ideas I have for NaNoWriMo, because there is that looming deadline of November 1st, just a few weeks away. But once I get through NaNoWriMo, assuming I survive, I think it would be really interesting to go through this book and do every single exercise, because so many of the exercises weren't just do this now for your current project. It was find a number of movies in your genre and watch them and see how they obey all of these rules and why that makes them work. So I think doing those exercises as a writer would give you so much more context for what works and what doesn't, and how successful writers pull it off. However, that is a subject for another time. At the moment, I need to start using these for the couple of ideas I have for NaNoWriMo. So let's get started. So something that I forgot to mention is that I am going to be continuing the same 3 book ideas that I was exploring in the Take Off Your Pants video. However, I'm going to be using the Save the Cat method from the beginning, so I'm not going to be expanding on what I did last time. I'm going to be starting from a blank page and seeing where I get using just the Save the Cat method, and then once I get to the end of the month and I've done all 3 plotting and planning methods, and take whichever elements from each of them work to create a master plan that I can use for NaNoWriMo. So I've attempted to do the first step of Blake's formula, which is to write a logline for the movie, or in this case the books. Now, this is something I'm finding really challenging, just because I feel like as a writer I'm far better with long form content than I am at having a snappy 1-sentence description of what something is about. Having said that, this is a really valuable skill for writers, because at some stage, hopefully, we're going to have books that we're pitching to publishers and we will need to be able to condense everything. So, according to Blake, a good logline needs 4 elements. The first one is irony, which he describes as a dramatic situation with an itch that you want to scratch. So, some of the examples he gives in the book are for Die Hard. A cop comes to LA to visit his estranged wife, and her office building is taken over by terrorists. Or Pretty Woman, a businessman falls in love with a hooker he hires to be his date for the weekend. So the way I'm interpreting irony in this case is there is a setup which leads the audience to expect something, and then you turn that expectation on its head. The next step is to create a compelling mental picture. So your logline should make it so that the audience can already picture the film or the book in their head. The next piece is tone, audience, and cost. So these aren't details that need to be spelled out in your logline, but the description should make it clear what the budget would be for this, if it's a movie, who the target audience is, and what the tone is. So another example he gives is 4 Christmases. So a newly married couple must spend Christmas Day at each of their 4 divorced parents' homes. And from that, he can tell that it's a mid-budget film because there aren't going to be any special effects or exotic destinations. It's just 4 different houses. He can tell it has fairly broad audience appeal. Obviously, it's a light Christmas movie, so that's what that criteria is covering. Then the final one is a killer title. And again, like the logline, this is something I struggle with because trying to put your idea into a couple of words is really challenging. I also don't think it's necessary at this stage because so many books get accepted by publishers and then they come up with brand new titles during the publishing process. However, I do think there's value in going through the process from end to end, so I've attempted to do this for the 3 ideas I was working on last time. And what's interesting about this is that it's made me realise which idea is the weakest of the 3, and it's not the one I was expecting based on what I did with Take Your Pants Off earlier this week. So I have 3 different ideas. One is a normal girl from a family of superheroes is forced out of her home with the ultimatum, don't come back until you have powers. Working title, Powerless. I don't know if that hits irony. You could argue that because she's normal but in a family of superheroes, that's a little bit of irony. But I do think that sets it up well. I think this is the cleanest of the 3. The next one is a storybook villain sentenced to hell after death decides to take over heaven. Working title, Happily Ever After. Again, not sure that it hits the irony. However, I like that idea for the title. I think that's a lot of fun because, you know, at the end of the story, you always think about the happily ever after and what happens for the villains. Do they get their happily ever after too? So I think that starts to create a compelling mental picture. I don't know, you tell me. I have no idea what I'm doing. The third idea is actually the one I struggled with the most in this exercise. And I think, so before I go into the logline that I'm working on, the idea was I had a dream and there was a family, and I'm just saying vampires for now, but the main thing is that they're immortal. So it's a family that's been trapped in a mansion for generations because there's some enemy outside that's not letting them escape. So they've been in this house for decades, maybe centuries, and the younger generation are frankly completely bored with this. So what they've done is they've set up the entire house as like a board game, and you know, there are challenges to get to different areas and they can experience points and so on, and it's just a way of keeping themselves amused. And the main objective in the plot was that the main character decided to add defeating the enemy to the board game as like defeating the final boss. And I can picture the world really clearly in my head and I can see the dynamics of the games. But when I came to trying to do a logline for this, I had 2 problems. One was that no one cares about teen vampires anymore, I don't think. I think we're all over them. So as soon as I started with like a bored teen vampire, I'm like, even I, as the one with the idea, start going, ugh. The other thing is that I don't know enough about the enemy. So all I've said is the lifelong enemy, but that's really vague and it doesn't create any fear or foreboding because that sort of terminology is 1, vague, but 2, also overused. I mean, everyone who has a half-baked idea is using these sorts of terms, you know, a lifelong enemy, a dark evil, and so on. So I think that until I address those 2 issues, I'm not going to be able to come up with a good logline. However, for the purposes of this exercise, what I have is a bored teen vampire trapped in a multi-generational family board game ups the stakes by inviting their lifelong enemy to play. Title, no idea. So, stage 1 done for now, and yeah, really, based on what I did with Take Your Pants Off, really surprised that the villain one is stacking up again, because that's the one I was struggling with last time, and that the vampire board games one is fizzling out. So it'll be interesting to see where I go with the rest of the process. So I'm back again on day 2, attempting to continue plotting my books with Save the Cat. And the next step is looking at your book's genre. So in Save the Cat, Blake has a chapter that's entirely on the different genres that pretty much every film falls into. So you can see them here: monster in the house, so that's small town or house where there's a monster outside, basically horror films. Golden Fleece is when the character goes on a quest to get something. Out of the Bottle is when a curse or a lotto win or a special power takes someone out of their everyday life and they need to deal with the change. Dude with a Problem is ordinary guy who's facing an extraordinary problem, so something like Die Hard. Rites of Passage, so pretty much self-explanatory. There's something wrong in the person's life and they need to come to terms with that's the way life is. Buddy Love is both friendship movies and romance movies. Why Done It is a film about explaining why something happened. The Full Triumphant, so Forrest Gump, anything with a clown as the main character who triumphs. Institutionalized, so this is about an institution, a family, a group of people who are all trapped together in the same universe. And then superhero films are self-explanatory. So when it comes to my 3 ideas, I went through the list of different genres and Blake Snyder's descriptions of each of them and tried to figure out which one was the best match for my ideas. What I have is Powerless and Happily Ever After are both Golden Fleece stories. Both of the characters go searching for something outside themselves, and what they discover is themselves. The one that was a bit more of a struggle, unsurprisingly, is the Vampire Board Games one. So just turn the page. With the Vampire Board Games one, I think it will either be monster in the house, so they're all trapped in a house, there's some sort of monster outside that's keeping them trapped. Or it could also be institutionalized. So institutionalized as a genre explores groups, institutions and families, and the group has a breakout character whose role is to expose the group as a fraud. And one of the themes that's explored is the pros and cons of putting the group before yourself. So this book could actually go in one of 2 ways. If it's Monster in the House, it's more of a traditional horror film book. If it's institutionalized, then rather than being a book that's about defeating the external enemy, the focus would really be on bringing to light the fact that the family are the ones that are keeping themselves trapped, and the people in the family, the characters in the family that have caused this. So I think that could be really interesting to explore, and what's really good about this exercise is I wouldn't have considered those 2 angles if the genres hadn't been spelt out in that way. New exercise, new angle, and as you're probably realizing, the first few exercises in this book are fairly short ones, and I don't mean that they don't take time to do, but the end result is short. It's, yes, I assign this idea to this genre, or yes, here's an adjective that describes this character, and the next exercise is, who is it about? And who is it about? You need an adjective to describe the hero, you need an adjective to describe the bad guy, and a compelling goal that we identify with as human beings. So with Powerless, normal girl, so normal is the adjective. The father is the bad guy in this, and I can't quite think of the right word for him, but I know the character, it's just finding the right adjective. So maybe just saying a father with high expectations, but he has high expectations, he's quite strict and autocratic. The first word I came up with was overbearing, but I don't feel like that's right, because when you think of overbearing parents, you think of like the smothering aspect as well, and I don't think that's true here. So something to work on. Happily Ever After, storybook villain. I do feel like that's an appropriate adjective here rather than having something that describes the character, because if it's built around the idea of what happens after Ever After, then I could potentially introduce a whole lot of story tropes that'll make it really interesting. So storybook villain. And this is where it all starts to fall apart. So the bad guy isn't, I'm not sure if there's going to be a personified antagonist, or if it's just going to be the world and the way it's set up and he needs to fight against the system, basically, to achieve his goal. And his goal is just that he wants his happily ever after as well. Unsurprisingly, the one where I ran into the most trouble is vampire board games. One, still have no idea who the villain is, which makes it really hard to come up with an adjective to describe them. But what was interesting is that I also struggled to find an adjective for the main character, because at first I was thinking, like, rebellious but because she's bored. But then I thought, well, what if she's, like, awkward or a more misfit teenager instead? In which case, that actually changes her goal, because if she's just bored, then her goal is, well, she wants to spice things up and make things more interesting, and a side effect of that is actually freeing her family, hopefully. Whereas if she is a misfit, then her goal would make more sense if it was around trying to prove herself to the rest of her family. And I feel like that's a lot more powerful and a lot more identifiable, so I'm going to play with that. So what we have at this point are a logline, a genre, and a character description, so who it's about. The next step is the famous beat sheet. So if we look at the book, you'll see there are 15 story beats. So opening image, theme stated, setup, catalyst, debate, break into two, B story, fun and games, midpoint, bad guys close in, all is lost, dark night of the soul, break into three, finale, and final image. The numbers next to each of these are the number of pages these should take up in a screenplay. I don't think knowing those is necessary for the planning part of the process. And obviously a novel is much longer than a screenplay, so those numbers would be higher. However, I think this could be really helpful for editing when you're trying to figure out what's going on too long and what doesn't have enough attention. Now when it comes to mapping these out, if you look at all three of my ideas, so this is Powerless, this is Vampire Board Games, and this is Happily Ever After, you'll see that the first half of each of them has stuff, but then I get a little bit lost from the midpoint, if not earlier. So now that I'm into the beat sheet part of the process, I thought it was worth relocating for a bit more of a chatty chat. As you saw from the shots of my notepad, I'm struggling with this a bit. I feel like the setup of each story is really clear, or somewhat clear, and then I don't really know where to go from there. And part of that could just be because I'm conscious of this process taking too long. I want to get done for the video, and that means I'm sort of trying to do each thing in one sitting rather than starting it, then taking a few days to let it marinate, then going back to it. So that's one part of it. Another part of it, though, is that I don't know how well, like this method and Take Your Pants Off and even story engineering, which I have tried before, I don't know how well they work for prompting ideas and generating ideas as opposed to organising what you already have. It's all very well and good to say, well, you need to have a B story, but you don't know what that B story is. It's like, do I just throw a romance in there so I have a B story? Things like that. The other challenge is that this process moves very quickly, which I do like, but it means there are a lot of things missing that ideally I would like to already know before I start attempting to plot out a book. So the process in Save the Cat is logline, genre, character, then beat sheet. Now that's a bit challenging when you get to the beat sheet, and the second stage in the beat sheet is setup. And in the setup, you're supposed to introduce every character or hint at every character who will have a significant role in the book. But at this stage, I haven't mapped out who the characters are, so it's like there's more work that needs to be done before you're ready to do the beat sheet, I feel. So this leaves me wondering whether this process is one that can be used from the beginning of the process to map out a screenplay or book, or whether it's better as a revision tool, so you just go off and attempt to write a first draft and see what happens and then go back and use this to figure out what's wrong with it, or if you just need a more solid idea than what I have, which could also be the case. The other thing to keep in mind is that the beat sheet isn't a comprehensive list of every single scene that will be in your movie or book. There are 15 beats you need to cover, but later in the book he says you should expect to have about 40 scenes. So obviously not every scene is in these beats. Some of these beats might be multiple scenes, some of the scenes might come between beats. And then there are some beats that might not need their own scenes. So if I look at the book, I can see that the opening image, theme stated, and setup are all in pages 1 to 10. So opening image is page 1, the theme should be stated on page 5, and then the setup is everything between pages 1 to 10. So there might not actually be 3 separate pieces there. There might be more, there might be less. All of that could potentially be covered in one scene. Similarly, you have the catalyst, which is what prompts the plot. It's the inciting incident. And then there's a debate. So the hero and the audience need to question whether this is actually going to happen. So it might be the hero questioning whether they want to do this, whether they can do this. So there's this debate section before you break into Act 2. And the breaking into Act 2 is when the hero decides that, yes, I am going to tackle this challenge, I am going to embark on this adventure. Now, potentially, the catalyst, the debate, and the break into Act 2 could all happen quite close together. In fact, they are one after the other in the beat sheet, but the catalyst could be someone says in a conversation, well, why don't we do this? And then the debate could be, oh no, we can't do that, and they argue back and forth for a bit, and then someone finally says, yes, let's do it. Now, probably not the most compelling way to go about it, but for the purpose of the example, you can see that this could all happen at once. So that means there are a lot of other scenes to think about beyond these beats. And honestly, I think it just needs a little bit more time to get it right. So at this stage, I'm actually not sure what to do. Even though it's cheating, part of me just wants someone to say, these are the 40 scenes that you need in your book, and this is what should happen in each one, and then I can just put my characters' names in there, and I can put my world in there, and it's sort of like book by numbers. Because, even though this is the second plotting method I'm trying, I'm really struggling to fill in the gaps. I simply don't know what happens. Yet, NaNoWriMo is coming up. It is my first time. I really don't want to fail. I really don't want to get through my first 10,000 words and then have no idea what comes next. But I'm starting to think maybe I won't be able to figure it out until I start writing. So who knows what's going to happen. So what I'm going to do is sit with this over the next couple of days and continue trying to flesh out those beats rather than pushing through to the next exercise, because I know that if I can't fill out these 15 beats, then the next exercise is going to be impossible. And at least if it's still impossible in a few days' time, I know I gave it a real go rather than just looking at it for 30 seconds going, well, I can't do this, and clearly plotting isn't for me. So thank you for watching. If you have used Save the Cat to plot your novel or screenplay, then I'd love to hear about your experiences in the comments below. If you've used another plotting method that has worked really well for you, then please let me know, because I'm really curious to try out as many methods as possible to see what works for me and what doesn't, and how they can potentially be combined to create the ultimate beat sheet. So other than that, please remember to like and subscribe, and I'll see you later this week with part 2 of my attempt to use Save the Cat to plot my novel. Bye.